He came over with a smile and a handshake. Your grandmother and I were good friends. She'd been dead 3 days and he was already lying to my face about stealing her land. I'm a 38-year-old project manager who just inherited my grandmother's house. She lived there for 52 years, raised my mother there, watched me grow up during summer visits, and spent her final years tending her garden and feeding the birds that gathered at the old oak tree in the backyard. When she passed peacefully in her sleep at 89, she left the property to me. 2.3 acres of rolling land with a 1920s farmhouse that needed work but had bones of iron and memories in every room. My wife and I saw it as an opportunity. We were tired of city life, tired of our cramped apartment, tired of neighbors who were strangers. This was our chance to build something. We'd renovate the old place, maybe start a small hobby farm, definitely plant a bigger garden than my grandmother ever had time for. We moved in the first week of March, boxes still unpacked, renovation plans spread across the kitchen table. That's when he appeared. The neighbor walked over on our third day, a stocky man in his mid-50s with a weathered face and an easy smile. He carried a casserole dish, his wife's famous chicken pot pie, he said. He shook my hand firmly, looked me in the eye, and spoke warmly about my grandmother. She was a wonderful woman, he said, settling into a chair on the porch like he'd done it 100 times before. We were good friends for years. Helped each other out, you know how neighbors do. She'd bring me tomatoes from her garden, I'd clear her driveway after snowstorms. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He seemed genuine. Neighborly. Exactly the kind of person you'd want living next door in a small community. There's just one thing I wanted to mention, he continued, his tone casual. The back area of the property, there's a small shed I built years ago. Your grandmother and I had an arrangement. She let me use that corner since she never did anything with it. Just wanted you to know so there's no confusion. I nodded, still operating on grief autopilot. Sure, no problem. Thanks for letting me know. He smiled, shook my hand again, and left the casserole dish. His wife's recipe, he reminded me. A gift. I didn't think about it again for 2 weeks. The renovation work kept us busy. Rewiring, replumbing, updating the kitchen while preserving its character. But one afternoon, when I needed a break from ripping out moldy drywall, I decided to walk the property. Really walk it, the way I had as a kid, following the fence lines and climbing the small hill at the back where my grandmother had let wildflowers grow. That's when the first alarm bell rang. The fence didn't look right. It cut through what I remembered being open land where I'd chased fireflies with my cousins, where my grandmother had planted bulbs that came up wild every spring. The fence now ran maybe 40 feet closer to the house than my childhood memories suggested. And the small shed the neighbor had mentioned? It wasn't small at all. It was a full workshop, maybe 600 square feet, with electricity running to it, a concrete pad, and double doors. It sat firmly on what I'd always thought was my grandmother's property. I told myself I was misremembering. It had been years since I'd spent a full summer here. Property lines could be confusing. Maybe the fence had always been there and I'd just forgotten. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Something gnawed at me. The next morning, I went into the attic where my grandmother had kept boxes of old photographs. She'd been meticulous about documenting her life. Photo albums labeled by year, negatives stored in envelopes, prints organized in shoeboxes with dates written in her careful handwriting. I found what I was looking for in a box marked 1987, House and Garden. There it was. A photograph of the backyard taken from the second-floor window. My grandmother in her garden, maybe 60 years old, smiling at the camera. And behind her, clearly visible, the fence. The old wooden fence that marked the property line. It was at least 40 feet farther back than where the current fence stood. I compared it to another photo from 1995, then 2003, then 2010. In each successive image, if you knew what to look for, you could see it. The fence had moved. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. A few feet here, a few feet there. And in the 2010 photo, the shed appeared. Just a small structure at first. By 2015, it had grown. By 2018, it was the full workshop I'd seen yesterday. 15 years. He spent 15 years slowly moving that fence, inch by inch, year by year. Waiting for an old woman to die so no one would remember where the real boundary was. I approached him the next day, trying to keep things casual. I mentioned I was looking at some old photos, noticed the fence might have shifted over the years. Asked if he remembered when exactly he'd built the shed. His demeanor changed instantly. The friendly neighbor disappeared, replaced by something cold and guarded. That fence has been there for 15 years, he said, his voice hard. Your grandmother agreed to it. We had an arrangement. You calling me a liar? No, the photos seem to show. Photos can be deceiving. Property lines are complicated. Your grandmother and I understood each other. He stepped closer, and I noticed how much bigger he was than me. Not threatening exactly, but aware of his size. You're new here. You don't know how things work. Don't start trouble over something your grandmother was fine with. I let it drop. But I didn't forget. The next week, I called a licensed surveyor, not anyone local, but a company from a city with no connections to the area. I paid extra for a rush job and comprehensive documentation. The surveyor arrived on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, I had my answer. The current fence line encroached 0.4 acres onto my property. The neighbor's shed sat 100% on my land, not close to the line, not partially over it, but fully and completely on property that belonged to me according to every legal record in existence. I had the survey framed. Then I walked over to the neighbor's house. He met me at his door, already defensive before I said a word. I handed him the survey documentation, pointed out the official markers, showed him exactly where his property ended and mine began. "This is wrong," he said, barely glancing at it. "I have my own survey. Been on file for 12 years. Show me." He did. A document that looked official enough, with stamps and signatures and a date from 2012. According to this survey, the property line ran exactly where his fence currently sat. According to this survey, he'd done nothing wrong. "There must be some mistake," I said, genuinely confused. "The surveys don't match." "No mistake." His confidence returned. "Your grandmother knew about this. She agreed to sell me that strip of land years ago. Then there should be a record. A deed. Something. It was informal. Between friends. You wouldn't understand." I went to the county recorder's office the next morning. I requested every document related to both properties, deeds, surveys, easements, anything. The clerk was helpful, even seemed interested when I explained the discrepancy. There was no record of any land sale. No deed transfer. No legal documentation of any agreement between my grandmother and the neighbor. According to county records, my grandmother had owned 2.3 acres from the day she bought the property in 1972 until the day she died. I asked about the neighbor's survey, the one from 2012. The clerk found it in the system. She frowned at the screen, then excused herself to get her supervisor. "Sir," the supervisor said when she returned, "I'm not sure how to tell you this, but there are some irregularities with this document. Would you mind waiting while we look into it?" I waited. They looked. And that's when the real story started to emerge. Update 1. 2 weeks later. The county surveyor's office launched an internal investigation based on the discrepancies I'd found. It turned out the official survey my neighbor had been waving around was connected to an employee who'd worked there for 15 years, a man who happened to be my neighbor's cousin. They'd been doing this together. The investigation revealed that the cousin had been altering survey records for years. Not always, just occasionally, just for family and close friends, just enough that no one noticed. A boundary shifted here, an easement modified there. Small changes that added up to big theft over time. But I wasn't satisfied with just uncovering the scheme. I needed to understand how deep it went. I started talking to other neighbors. The older ones who'd lived in the area for decades. One woman, now in her 80s, remembered my grandmother well. She also remembered the neighbor who lived on the other side of my nemesis, an elderly widow named Mrs. Patterson who died in 2015. "Shame about her property," the old woman said. "Her family sold it not 3 months after she passed. Never even walked it properly. New owners built that big house. You've seen it, the modern one? They have no idea they're probably on smaller land than they paid for." I dug deeper. Found the listing from when the Patterson property sold. 3.1 acres, according to the records. But when I looked at aerial photos from before and after, compared them to the current fence lines, I could see it. The neighbor had done the same thing. Moved his fence, claimed the land, waited for the old woman to die and her family to sell without questioning. He'd stolen from at least 2 elderly people. Maybe more. That's when I hired an attorney. Not just any attorney, a real estate litigation specialist with a reputation for being relentless. I told her everything. The surveys, the photos, the county investigation, the pattern of behavior. "This isn't a boundary dispute," she said when I finished. "This is systematic fraud. And we're going to prove it." We filed a formal complaint with the county. We requested a comprehensive investigation into every survey the neighbor's cousin had ever filed. We subpoenaed records, interviewed former neighbors, built a timeline of theft spanning 2 decades. And my neighbor, he went to war. Update 2, 6 weeks later. The other neighbors told me he'd done this before. An elderly widow on the other side. She died, the family sold the house, never knew they'd lost a quarter acre. He'd been doing this for 20 years. Once we filed our lawsuit, the harassment began. First, it was small things. His dogs, 3 large German shepherds he'd never seemed to have before, appeared in his yard. They barked constantly. They, accidentally, got loose onto my property at least twice a week. They left presents on my lawn, my porch, my driveway. Then his trucks started appearing. He had 2, both massive diesel pickups. Every morning I'd wake up to find one of them parked across the end of my driveway, blocking me in. It was always an accident. He was always sorry. He'd move it eventually, usually after I was already late for wherever I needed to be. Then came the code enforcement complaints. He called code enforcement on me 6 times in 2 months. Fake complaints. Harassment. He thought he could bully me into giving up. He didn't know I'm more stubborn than he is patient. The complaints were creative, I'll give him that. My renovation dumpster was an illegal structure. My grandmother's garden shed, which had stood for 40 years, was suddenly a code violation. The temporary porta-john we'd rented during the bathroom renovation was illegally positioned. My wife's car, parked in our own driveway, was abandoned and derelict. Every complaint was unfounded. Every inspection cleared us. But every inspection also took time, energy, attention. That was the point. He was trying to exhaust us. One afternoon, he caught me in the driveway and dropped all pretense. "You should have left it alone," he said, his voice low and cold. "Your grandmother never complained. She was smart enough to know when to keep her mouth shut. You're making a big mistake. You'll regret this." When I showed him the real survey, he didn't apologize. He threatened me. "You'll regret this." That's when I knew he'd gotten away with it before. He expected me to back down like everyone else. I didn't back down. I installed security cameras. I documented every incident. I filed counter-complaints for harassment. Our attorney sent a cease and desist letter. He escalated further. Filed his own lawsuit claiming adverse possession, the legal doctrine that if you use someone else's land openly and continuously for long enough, it becomes yours. He claimed he'd maintained that 0.4 acres for 15 years, that my grandmother had known about it and never objected, that it was effectively his property now. It was a bold move. It was also his biggest mistake. Because to prove adverse possession, he had to submit documentation. His surveys, his timeline, his evidence of open and notorious use. And once we had that documentation, we could tear it apart. The discovery process was brutal, for him. Update 3, 4 months later. Our attorney was worth every penny. During discovery, she subpoenaed records not just from my neighbor but from the county surveyor's office, from the properties on either side of his, from every transaction he'd been involved in for the past 20 years. What we found was staggering. He hadn't just stolen land from my grandmother and Mrs. Patterson. There were at least 3 other properties where he'd pulled the same scheme. Always elderly owners. Always gradual encroachment. Always informal arrangements, with no documentation. Always a conveniently timed survey from his cousin showing the boundaries he wanted them to show. Over 2 decades, he'd accumulated nearly 2 acres of stolen land. 2 acres taken foot by foot, year by year, from people who trusted him. People who thought he was their friend. My grandmother lived there 52 years. She baked cookies for that man. She thought he was her friend. He was stealing from her the whole time, just waiting for her to die. The county investigation finished around the same time. The neighbor's cousin was terminated immediately. Criminal charges were filed for falsifying public records, a felony in our state. The entire surveyor's office was audited. 3 other employees faced disciplinary action for insufficient oversight. And then the local news found out. I didn't contact them. Someone at the county must have leaked the story. But once they started digging, they couldn't stop. The headline ran on a Thursday evening, "Man exposed for decades of land theft scheme, elderly victims targeted." They interviewed 3 families who'd been affected. They showed aerial photos demonstrating the fence movements over time. They explained the cousin's role in falsifying surveys. They made my neighbor the face of elder abuse, property theft, and small-town corruption. His phone stopped ringing. Neighbors who'd smiled at him for years crossed the street to avoid him. His wife, apparently unaware of his schemes, moved out within a week. His own children released a statement distancing themselves from his actions. He was alone. But the legal process still had to play out. Update 4, 8 months later. The court date finally arrived on a crisp October morning. My wife and I sat behind our attorney in a courtroom that had seen 100 boundary disputes, but nothing quite like this. The neighbor looked diminished. Gone was the confident man who'd shown up on my porch with a casserole dish and a smile. He sat hunched beside a public defender. His private attorney had dropped him when the money ran out, and avoided eye contact with everyone. The evidence was overwhelming. Our attorney presented the original 1972 deed and survey, crystal clear on the boundaries. She showed the progression of aerial photos documenting the fence's movement. She presented testimony from longtime neighbors, from the terminated county employee who'd agreed to cooperate in exchange for a lighter sentence, from the families of other victims. His adverse possession claim collapsed immediately. You can't claim land through adverse possession when your possession was based on forged documents and a criminal conspiracy. The law requires good faith possession. There was nothing good faith about what he'd done. The judge's ruling was comprehensive. First, the land. All 0.4 acres returned to my property immediately, with the court ordering the removal of any structures, including his workshop, within 30 days at his own expense. Second, the fence. He was required to restore the original boundary line as documented in the 1972 survey, again at his own expense. Third, damages. The court awarded us $47,000, covering our legal fees, the cost of multiple surveys, documented harassment, and general damages for the years of theft from my grandmother's estate. Fourth, and perhaps most significantly, the ruling noted that the evidence suggested a pattern of deliberate fraud across multiple properties over multiple decades, and recommended the matter be referred for criminal prosecution. He stood there as the judgment was read, and I watched something break behind his eyes. This wasn't a man who'd made a mistake. This was a man who'd built a life on theft and manipulation, who'd preyed on the vulnerable and trusted that no one would ever hold him accountable. He was wrong. Update 5. Final update. 1 year later. The criminal trial concluded last month. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts of filing false documents, fraud, and theft by deception. The judge, unimpressed by his attempt to show remorse, sentenced him to 18 months in county jail followed by 3 years of probation. He was also ordered to pay restitution to all identified victims, a figure that, combined with the civil judgments, exceeded $200,000. He couldn't pay. Of course he couldn't pay. The only significant asset he had was his house. I watched from across the property line as the "for sale" sign went up. Watched as strangers walked through his home during open houses. Watched as the bank eventually foreclosed when it didn't sell fast enough to cover his debts. The new neighbors are a young couple with a baby. They wave when they see us. They have no idea about the history of the property line between us, and I don't burden them with it. Some stories don't need to be passed on. The workshop came down on a Saturday in November. A crew arrived at dawn, and by sunset, nothing remained but a concrete pad. A month later, I had that removed too. Now there's just grass where he built his shrine to stolen land. The fence was restored to its original position. It took a surveyor, a fencing company, and 2 days of work, but when it was done, I could finally see my grandmother's property the way it was supposed to look. The way it had looked before he started his campaign of quiet theft. I walked the full perimeter for the first time on a cold December afternoon. 2.3 acres. Every inch of it. I followed the fence line through the back, past the wildflower hill, around the old oak tree that had somehow ended up on his side of the stolen boundary. My wife found me there as the sun was setting. "Was it worth it?" she asked. "All the stress, all the legal fees, all the fights?" I thought about my grandmother. About the summers I'd spent here, chasing fireflies and picking tomatoes and listening to her stories on the porch. About the decades she'd lived in this house, trusting the man next door, never knowing he was slowly, methodically taking what was hers. I thought about Mrs. Patterson, who died not knowing a quarter of her property had been stolen. About her family, who sold the house and moved on, never understanding they'd been robbed. I thought about the other victims. The elderly, the trusting, the vulnerable. People who couldn't fight back. People who didn't know they needed to. He stole from my grandmother for 15 years while she baked him cookies and thought he was her friend. He did it to other old people too. People who trusted him. People who couldn't fight back. Yeah, it was worth it. Not just for the land. For everyone he thought would never stand up to him. My wife took my hand, and we walked back to the house in the fading light. Epilogue, spring. I scattered some of my grandmother's ashes by the old oak tree, the one that's back on our property now, where it always should have been. I told her we got it back. All of it. I like to think she knew all along what he was doing. She just needed someone young enough and stubborn enough to stop him. The garden is coming in nicely this year. My wife planted tomatoes where my grandmother used to, and sunflowers along the restored fence line. The wildflowers on the hill came up on their own, just like they always have, just like they will for years to come. Sometimes I stand at the back of the property and look at where his workshop used to be. There's no trace of it now. The grass has grown over the bare earth. In a few more years, you won't be able to tell anything was ever there at all. That's the thing about people like him. They think they can take whatever they want, that the world will bend to their schemes, that the vulnerable will stay quiet and the truth will stay buried. But land remembers. Records survive. And eventually, someone asks the right questions. He's in county jail now, sharing a cell with people who don't care about property lines or adverse possession or which survey says what. His house belongs to strangers. His family wants nothing to do with him. His name, in this community, is synonymous with fraud and betrayal. And I'm sitting on my grandmother's porch, drinking coffee, watching the morning light move across 2.3 acres of land that belongs to me. All of it. Every inch. She would have loved that. TLDR, inherited grandmother's house, discovered neighbor had been slowly stealing land for 15+ years by moving fences and forging surveys with help from his cousin at the county office. Found out he'd done this to multiple elderly victims over 2 decades. Hired an attorney, filed complaints, endured harassment, won lawsuit. Neighbor had to remove his shed, restore fence, pay damages, and faced criminal charges. Lost his house, went to jail. Property restored to original boundaries. Grandmother's land is whole again. Edit. Thank you for all the awards and kind words. Several people have asked about the legal process. Happy to answer questions. Also, for those asking, yes, I did eventually eat the chicken pot pie he brought over. It was mediocre at best. Edit 2. For everyone suggesting I should have accidentally damaged his equipment or confronted him physically, no. That's not how you win these fights. You win with documentation, patience, and good legal counsel. Violence gives people like him an excuse to play the victim. The legal system, when you use it correctly, takes everything from them and leaves them with no one to blame but themselves. That's real justice.